right, so we are going to go ahead and get started. So I want to welcome everyone to our second installment of our Distinguished Lecturer Series, Industry Connect. And today we have the honor and the privilege to have Dr. Morie, Jackie Morie, from, she's an ACM Distinguished Speaker. And so, again, we're very, very pleased to have her. She has degrees in both art and computer science. She has more than 25 years experience in developing innovative techniques for rich, emotionally evocative virtual reality. A little bit of a tongue twister there for me. And as part of her pioneering work, she invented a scent collar to bring the emotional power of smell to immersive experiences and developed new types of functions for VR, such as connections to multiple sensor and feedback systems to make VR more effective. Dr. Morie spent 13 years as a senior research scientist at USC's Institute for Creative Technologies. She helped found that institute, by the way. And while she was there, she created VR telehealth care activities using deep understanding of art, computer animation, and human behavior to enhance patient engagement with those programs. In the mid-1990s, Dr. Morie started a comprehensive computer animation training programs at Walt Disney at their feature animation, and combined art and technology topics, which she later expanded to special effects industries at studios such as Rhythm and Hughes. And then prior to that, Dr. Morie worked at UCF's Institute for Simulation and Training, where she developed techniques to make VR environments more immersive and emotionally compelling. And she helped lead a group of innovative students called the Toy Scouts, which I think is just a fun name. She has been expanding her VR research to include neuroscience and avatars, developing methods to determine how such technologies can affect positive change in those who use them. She was part of the DARPA Information Science and Technology think tank from 2011 through 2015, and she lectures extensively on how technology will affect our future selves and humanity. And so without further ado, we welcome Dr. Morie. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. And this is going to be a little bit of a wild ride today. I'm going to be talking about many of the things that Bonnie mentioned in the bio that she spoke to. So you'll get to see some examples of that. Now, I won't go through everything, and some things are going to be very quick, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now. And let's see, where is that? That is present now. And we're going to go to this one. All right, I think we're there, and then I'm going to say play from the start. So we got it? Everybody see my screen? I don't see anybody or hear anybody, so.
It's working well. I can see it fine.
Great. Okay, so the title of this talk is Creating Meaningful Works of Virtual Reality Experiences. And I'm really happy to share some of these thoughts today that I have been coming up with over the last 3 decades. So I think, there's some valuable information here for people who are embarking on creating virtual reality. But first, I want to say a few words about ACM. ACM, the Association for Computing Machinery, is a premier global community of computing professionals and students, more than 100,000 members in 170 countries. And it's really a place that's very rich to get content and to connect with other people. We, because I'm part of ACM for many years now, our mission is to help computing professionals to be their best and most creative. We connect them to their peers and to what the latest developments are and inspire them to advance the profession and make a positive impact on society. We see a world where computing helps solve tomorrow's problems and where we use our knowledge and skills to advance through the computing profession and make positive social impact throughout the world. And I am very, very happy to be an ACM member all these years. So thank you to ACM for making the Distinguished Speakers Program possible and getting so much more information out there shared among professionals and students alike. Everybody should join this, even as a student. All right, so the outline of my talk. I am going to start with a little bit about my background and my early VR work. That's from the last century. And then I'm going to talk about VR artworks from the very early days, also from the last century. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what makes VR a very unique medium in its own right. I'll talk about some of my later work and the research I did into creating meaningful VR experiences. I'll touch briefly on my PhD work because that is where I put everything together and came up with key points for designing for VR. Then we'll go into the seismic shift that happened in 2012 for VR. And then I'll talk about some later works where I'm harnessing the power of VR for good, and a little bit about VR art and experiences as they exist today. So my background, I love art and science, and I have been looking my whole life for something that combined the two. In my early years, I thought I would go into medical illustration because that combined both the artistic and the scientific. But I ended up kind of dropping that and going totally into fine art and mostly into experimental photography. That actually led me into learning about computer graphics. And I have to tell you, this was really early on. This is in the 1970s. So computer graphics was a very fledgling area back then. But I learned it, and I learned how to program imagery and learned a lot about what was going on in the research end of computer graphics. That led me into 3D modeling, of course, which ended up with me applying to computer science grad school and getting in. And then I was able to dig deep into the computer science aspect of computer graphics. I was always very process oriented, and I wanted to know how things work at a very deep level. And so by getting a computer science degree and really understanding how to program graphics, I was able to understand that process. I also worked in some animation work very early on, and that led me to virtual reality. My art has always been about creating an emotional connection. And I found that with computer science, I could do the same thing. It was a little harder, had to kind of force it into that mold, but it was not impossible. So when I started building 3D environments, I came up with these sort of fanciful environments that put a lot of things in it. And I thought they were really beautiful, but I wanted to put people inside them. And I didn't know how to do that. So before VR came on the scene, so we're talking about these in early 80s, early 1980s, I would build these things, and I would render out two images, stereo images of the scenes. And then I would show them in a stereo viewer like this setup here, so that you could just pick up the viewer and hold it, towards the light, and then you could see a 3D scene, a little more 3D than you could just looking at the 2D images. So that was in the early 80s, but by the 1989 and the early 90s, I had learned about VR. And I worked my way into a research lab in Orlando, Florida, in what I call the second wave of VR. This is when it started getting into research labs and past the original, military funding sources that helped it in the 60s and 70s. This is when VR expanded so that people were really exploring what it could do, what it needed to be more realistic, and just trying out how it affects us. So I was in this lab and working with the Army research scientist doing perceptual and usage studies. Could we use VR to train someone what it was like in a different building? Did that work as well as just showing them photos of the building or taking them through a physical walk through the building? And also things like, very basic things like, how well could we see in these headsets of that day? We put in eye charts, and we found out that almost everybody was legally blind in those early headsets. But everything was so intriguing. VR was new. There was so much to discover. Very few people on the planet had actually tried VR at that point. But one thing I found out the environments that we were building, the environments that you could experience were so boring. There was like very little there, even though you felt like you had been taken to another place. It didn't feel like there was anything when you got there. So I wanted to see how to evoke emotional responses like I had done in my artwork in VR participants and give them something to remember. This is a typical state of the art of VR in 1992 when I was working at the Institute for Simulation and Training in Orlando. This is the SGI Performer Town. This was state of the art. These were the fastest, best graphic computers out there. And these were typical of the environments in Performer Town. And you could do things like change the weather, put up fog. You could navigate around this town. But what do you notice? I mean, they're really empty. These were super empty, pristine, clean worlds. They didn't have a lot of the marks of humanity. So after hours, when I wasn't working on the research projects, I partnered with another colleague at the research lab, and we started to make something we called Vertopia. And we were both interested in evoking emotional responses with the VR experience. And we did things where each environment that you would go into was designed to evoke some different kind of emotional response. The Fang City that you see on the lower left was designed to kind of create a sense of angst, and I'll show you a little bit of that. The one on the upper right was called the Conversation Room, and when you were in that, it was like you were in a party, but there were no people around. It was really hard to put people back in those days, put people into VR, or at least at 3D models of people. So this was the invisible crowd. But as you looked at the photos in that photo album on the table, or you went up to one of the walls with this sort of conversation abstract picture, you would hear snippets of conversation. You would be able to comprehend what the people were saying. And they were always kind of mysterious and intriguing bits of conversation. So my partner for this was Mike Goslin, and he ended up going to Disney Imagineering and working on many of the VR projects that they had there starting in '94. And I ended up going to Disney Feature Animation. This is the interface for our Vertopia project. It was a vast barren desert, and you could fly over this desert and come to one of these oases. The oases were very primitive because we didn't have a lot of polygons to work with. I think our texture maps were 128 pixels wide, whether we needed that many pixels or not. And every one of these oases had a little stone pool, and you could jump into that pool and it would take you to one of these different worlds. We ended up designing about 8 of them. I'm going to try and play a little bit of this just so you can see how primitive it was. Although we had fully spatialized sound back then, we had borrowed a $100,000 headset from Envision that gave us 90-degree field of view. Still not that many pixels, but it was state of the art for the time. So here's a little bit of this. Let's see if it'll. So it was the SGI version with convolved sound. Here we are flying over one of the oases. And this particular world was haunted by wraiths, and the wraiths would run away from you. You could never catch up to them. And we were able to do some things where we paged in these forests so that they were endless. So as soon as you got near the end, we paged in another whole set of them, so you could go forever in one direction. So that was a little bit haunting. I'll go to another one. This was a little crazy world. We will go to, this was the Fang City. Starts out as a very pastoral scene, and the clocks are ticking normally. And then as you're in here, it switches to this cacophonous sound, and clocks are clanging everywhere. And buildings are tearing through the surface like teeth, and the sky is no longer across the sky. It's these polygons of sky that go swirling around you. So again, a very angst-ridden world. And then, so we had, like I said, we had quite a few of these. This was the conversation room. I'll play just a little of that. Let's see, the sound doesn't start right away.
And someone has suddenly retracted it. You start to fall.
And these are recordings of someone's first-person view in the virtual world at that time. So this is what somebody was actually seeing and hearing when they were inside the VR with a headset.
You know, he saw it as a journey, a new beginning, but I think she saw it as a fork in the road, an endless future of wondering what might have been.
So it was really hard to navigate. We had a space ball that we navigated with. I'm going to just show you a little bit of this world. This was called the spider world. And this was interesting because we had this spider have 8 states, from ignore you to attack you. And each state was connected to a different rhythm of a heartbeat. And you were hearing this heartbeat in spatialized 3D sound. And it was somewhat random. So you might go towards the spider and he might run away, or he might decide to come attack you. What was interesting about this is that we were using a principle called entrainment, where the rhythm of what you were hearing in the heartbeat actually made your heart beat faster. And interestingly enough, this was one where many people were so scared that they took the headset off and went from the room. And we were able to show all of the Vertopia pieces at the Florida Film Festival in 1992 and 93. So this makes it the first VR that was ever shown at a film festival. Today, it is the place to show your VR, film festivals like Sundance and others around the world. But this was the first. And we put a lot of people through this. And those that stayed all had some kind of emotional experience. Those that were in the spider, they didn't have such a good experience. But, you know, they at least knew they could get out. So it was a very successful thing. Mike Goslin in the white pants there and I were very, very happy that we showed that you could actually put emotions into VR. This made us realize that VR is a unique art form and a medium of its own. A few other places were starting to recognize this new form of engagement. And one of the big places was amusement parks. So at the International Amusement Park Conference every year called IAAPA, you started to see these things come in and you could go and try them out at these conferences. This is me trying out one where I look somewhat like an alien. And then Virtuality, which did both of these, made pods where you could have shared experiences. And they put these in places where you could go to them even on your lunch hour and have a VR experience. So some of this stuff actually worked its way into some amusement parks. Like I said, Mike Goslin went and worked for Disney Imagineering, and they did a really wonderful piece called Aladdin's Ride, where you were on a magic carpet flying through the cartoon town from the Aladdin film. But also artists were starting to look at VR differently. And in Canada, the Banff Center's Art and Virtual Environments program was started in the 1990s. Now, the Banff Center has always been a place to do wonderful media. And they were really prescient in saying VR can be an art form. So what they did was put out all kinds of equipment. They invited specific artists to come and have a residency there for a year or two. And they gave them everything they needed to put together the ideas in their head and to realize them as an interactive, immersive virtual reality experience. Over the 3-year period that this program was in existence, 9 pieces were made. And it was some of the most advanced VR being done anywhere in the world. Artists could push this medium like nobody else. They were not shy about saying, what if? We're going to look at about 3 of these 9 pieces and just see what was going on. Whoops, wrong way. One of the most incredible ones was done by Brenda Laurel and her team, and it was called Placeholder. I won't get into all the details, but Brenda had a theater degree. In fact, her dissertation was Computers as Theater. And she did a VR piece that took a lot of inspiration from the native lands around Banff. And they went out and they actually digitized and did some photogrammetry of the space. And that was the background of what people would see in the virtual world. Now, it also could network up to 4 people together. And so you shared the space with others. The interesting thing about Placeholder was that when you got into the VR, you took on the form of a spirit animal. So you can see this guy in the middle here. He's flying with his arms. He was a crow or a raven. You could be a fish. You could be a snake. And they modulated the voice so that it sounded more like the spirit animal that you were inhabiting. On the right here, we see Brenda herself in one of these head-mounted displays of the time. The other interesting thing that they did was they allowed you to leave messages. So you would see these icons, and this was a placeholder message object. If it had the first icon, it was asleep. You could wake it up. It would show the second icon. It would be ready to receive your voice message with the third icon. And then if it had a message to play back for a future participant, you would see the final icon. If this wasn't enough, there was also the theatrical aspect to it. You see there's sort of a little set here with the different spaces outlined by rocks and a little green center. Brenda would also be part of this environment as sort of the stage manager. And she could say, Crow, are you flying over to Snake right now? And she could manage the actions of the participants in this way. So you can see Placeholder had a lot of firsts and a lot of really unique ways to think about VR. There is a record of this on Vimeo. So if you're interested, you can pull up that Vimeo and look at it. Quite fascinating. Another artist, Tony Dove, was working with Michael McKenzie, and they came up with something called the archaeology of a mother tongue. Now, that archaeology piece was kind of a VR movie. It was 45 minutes long, and it had the story of a coroner who goes to investigate the death of a child in a village. And through a series of actions and interactions, comes to find out that it was something that happened there, and she was there when it happened as a child. 45 minutes is a very long time to be in a VR. So this, again, was a big first. If you see this gray object over here towards the right, that is a depiction of your hand in the VR environment. So you would have a glove on, and the way you moved in many of these VR environments back then was to point your finger in the direction you wanted to move, and then kind of beat your other fingers back to say, let's move faster or slower. It was a very strange way of navigating, but that was kind of the standard back then. But Archaeology of a Mother Tongue is fascinating in that it's one of the first sort of interactive VR movies in 45 minutes. The last artist we'll look at from Banff is Lawrence Paul Jacquelyn, and he was a native First Nations artist already working in Canada, and they invited him to come in and build VR. And what he built was the longhouse, the spiritual longhouse of his people, so that others could come in and kind of get the atmosphere of being in the longhouse. Now you notice the way it was set up was not so much with the head-mounted display, but with something you came and put your eyes up to, much more like a stereo viewer. So people were able to try all kinds of new ideas here and just push the technology in ways that it might not have otherwise been pushed. Many of the people that worked here went on to do more VR, and many of the programmers and developers that came in to help the artists are still making VR today. This legacy of VR art, this 30 years that we have been making VR, is an amazing group of works. Unfortunately, these things are very hard to keep running. They were built on unique equipment that was all cobbled and coded together so that it would keep running. Most of these experiences, with very few exceptions, are no longer available for anyone to experience. Even the record of what went on used to be super hard to find. Today it's a little easier because now many of these early artists are pulling out their documentation out of their trunks and things to get it digitized so that we can see. Tony Dove just had the entire 45 minutes of Archaeology of a Mother Tongue digitized, and that just happened a couple of years ago. In about 2007, I cataloged the first 100 VR artworks that had happened from about 1989 till that time. And there really were only about 100 I could find back then. This is available on my website, and I'll tell you more about that in a little bit. There is one other piece I want to talk about in terms of this early VR art, and these are actually two pieces by an artist named Shar Davies. She was a painter. She always painted these things that were full of light and very ethereal and very mysterious. And she did two pieces, one called Osmos and one called Ephemerae. And they took you through sort of very spiritual locations and through seasons and through going from the top of a tree down through its roots, and just really looking at nature in a very different way. These were very spiritual experiences. The people that got to go in these were moved to tears often. They were shown in a museum a couple of times, and when they were shown in a museum, the person who was in the VR was behind this sort of orange screen. So you could see what they were doing, and you could see the visuals on another screen, and you could sit out in sort of the audience area and watch this person having this experience. The way you navigated in these was based on Shar's experience as a scuba diver. So they put a respiration band around the participant's chest, and when you breathed in, you went up, and when you breathed out, you went down. And so that act of breathing became part of the experience. It relaxed you. It made you feel like your body was actually causing many of these things to happen in the virtual world. This piece has been absolutely one of the most iconic pieces of VR art ever made, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, because, as I said, it's very hard for these pieces to be experienced today. Shar's pieces from the 1990s were rebuilt in 2001 by some of the original programmers and people who had been at Banff, and they were revamped for the equipment of 2001, and they were shown at a museum, which is where I got to go see them. And then they couldn't be run again for the last few years. And so the same team is right now rebuilding Shar's work for the newest systems out there, so they'll be available to see again. Now, I want to go over some of the critical aspects that makes VR a unique medium. It is experiential above all else. So you are having an experience. Most VR, because of the headset, separates the user from the physical world and puts them in a cognitively real alternative world, feeling the sense of presence, like they're really somewhere. VR capitalizes on the embodiment, where you use one's body in the VR space, whether it's breathing or moving with your hand or walking or whatever it is. That navigation through the space requires your body or some part of your body. And that ties you very tightly to the virtual space. True VR also has to include agency, where people can make choices. Whatever they want to do, they can turn and walk this way, they can fly over there, they can pick up this object or not. And that makes it a very different experience for each person who goes in it, because those choices are personal. Artists are the ones that I think have done the most to advance these VR ideas and capabilities. There was a lot of research done in the 1990s and 2000s to get more functionality into VR, more resolution, more higher, higher rendering rates and frame rates. But the actual, what you can do in it, I think, is something that the artists have been really integral at making happen. All right, I'll take a breath here. Next, I'm going to just talk a little bit about my later work. I call these my research years. I was lucky to help start the USC Institute for Creative Technologies in 1999. And the work that I got to do was to really push all of my ideas about how to bring emotional impact to these virtual reality environments. Now, we were funded by the military, and they're interested, of course, in VR for training, which is what the original funding for the earliest VR, the sort of first wave of VR, was all about. Now, anytime somebody goes in a virtual reality environment for training, there are certain things that they can learn, in terms of how to pick this up or how to drive a tank or whatever it happens to be. But they don't feel that sense of danger and urgency that they would feel on the ground in a threatening situation. My thinking was, if we could get that emotional response in there, maybe it would feel more real to them and they would take it more seriously. So DarkCon was supposed to look at this. How do we evoke those strong emotional responses? The first thing we asked ourselves was, well, what do we have to work with? We have what I call the perceptual palette. And this includes not only sight, the visuals, the sound, which can be fully spatialized. It can include other senses like smell and touch. It also looks to that feeling that you get of your body in the space, the kinesthetic sensibilities, proprioception, and all of those things. We also have a lot of psychological things that we can use to promote emotional responses. We can put in subliminal cues that prime people for stuff. We can use priming before they even get into the virtual world. We can threshold them with the concepts that we kind of want them to come away with when they actually get in the VR space. And more. There was so much more that we could figure out back then, but it was all new. We were going not for photoreal, which is what the rest of the VR world was going for, but feels real. It was getting deep into the psychology of the experience, and that changes the game. So the C project, the Sensory Environment Evaluation Project, allowed us to build what was back then a pretty high-res world. We had to fake a lot of techniques to do this high-res world. We put you in a deep, dank culvert, which stunk and had a lot of clues about how to move you through that space and to tell you where to go. We had strange sounds that you couldn't quite tell where they were coming from. We put people through this as a study, and we added heart rate and skin conductance and other sensors to them so that we could see if we were getting the reactions that we had designed where we had designed them to happen. So I don't have enough time to go into all of this, but you can see we had things like bats hanging from the ceiling, and when you went under them, you startled them, and that evoked a startle response in you. But the bats also flew out a certain direction, which would tell you how to get out of this culvert and out to where the riverbank was. We gave you a mission, which was to see if this abandoned mill complex on the other side of the river was inhabited by paramilitary forces or refugees. And there were a lot of clues in the culvert to say it could be one or the other. And then you had to find a place to get close so that you could really tell what was going on. If you thought it was paramilitary forces, you were to drop a GPS device, and that was the mission. So we put hundreds of people through this world and found that we got the desired responses everywhere we had designed them. We showed this in what we called our VR theater. Now, this was basically set up for demos. We had a curved 120-degree curved screen with the spatialized sound components behind it and around the room. The person in the VR space would be standing on this stage with the headset on. And the screen was mainly for the audience and the people that were coming in to see our demos. So it wasn't exactly what the person was seeing, but it was representative of what they were seeing in the headset. Now, I expanded the VR theater to have not only the 3D sound, the real-time 3D sound, but an infrasonic floor. So I had a local company build this infrasonic floor, which had 10 subsonic transducers that we could play between 4 and 20 hertz. So below the threshold of hearing, but your body viscerally felt these. We used that infrasound to have an emotional score that you didn't hear, but you felt throughout that DarkCon experience. And funny enough, it was without the infrasound that it was the most relaxing. So when you got to the end of the culvert and you were out at the riverbank, there was no infrasound. But when you were deep inside of it, the infrasound was very disturbing, even though you didn't hear it. And we, again, with the sensory input, or the sensor devices on the participant, we found out that it worked exactly as we predicted. So the idea was not to make each component as high fidelity as possible, but to create a sensory gestalt where you put all of these techniques and senses and psychological components together to come up with something that was greater than the sum of its part. Part of this was to add scent. Now, you could put scent in a VR back then, but it was usually a big box that had these huge cartridges in it, and it stunk up the room, and you had to use an HVAC system to get the smell out. And my fellow researchers said, nope, you're not doing that. I even got some of those, and one of the things that we wanted was the smell of diesel exhaust. And they said, no, we're not doing that. So I said, okay, I'll invent something that keeps it very localized, just comes right to your nose. It will not stink up the room, and it will be much more personal. So I invented this scent collar, got a patent on it back in 2009, I think. And we used this for these studies. And it works on a very airflow over a passive reservoir of scent. So it doesn't spray anything at you. It just wafts the smell towards your nose. And in this version, you could have up to 4 different scents. So we had bat guano, and we had the stinky culvert, and we had the fresh riverbank. And at the very end, almost everybody gets set upon by a vicious dog. So we had smelly dog in there too. So it was a very interesting use of scent. We are still working on this now. We're up to version 4. We're now calling it Reminiscent, and we're doing much nicer smells like a French pastry chef's kitchen. So you can pick up these little macaroon cookies and smell the different flavors. while I was doing all that work, I decided that, VR was not doing so well in the commercial world, and I better take everything I'd learned and encapsulate it into a PhD. And so I did that. And everything I learned is in this particular thesis, and it's available for download at morie.org. And it's a lot more than I can talk about here, but really has some of the techniques that we developed and used for these emotionally evocative virtual reality experiences. As part of that PhD, there was a practice-based component, and I did a piece called The Memory Stairs, which had nothing to do with the military. It was a series of experiences from before birth to near death. And we used this crazy experimental headset. We're talking 2005 here. This is not when VR hit the streets. This was VR still very much in a research lab, and crazy Wi-Fi head-mounted displays that people could barely keep on their heads. Now, I just want to go back and reiterate what I see a VR experience as being. It is a series of potential events that gets combined with the participants' free will. All right, so you don't really know how they're going to come in and behave. How do you make this into a cohesive experience? How do you organize the events that could happen into some kind of meaningful structure where the participant actually understands the cause and effect, the agency they're having? We came up with a few techniques to help create a cohesive experience in the midst of all of this possibility. One was corroborative detail, where you have the marks of time or humanity. There's details everywhere, just like there would be in the real world. This seems, okay, every game has this now, but back then it wasn't so well understood. And so it was, it took that very pristine kind of performer world that we had started with back in the day that was so empty and clean, and put these marks of time or humanity on it, and had evidence of not only coherence, but persistence of the world. It might be different the next time you come in. You might be able to do different things. We also came up with the concept of coercive narrative. This is putting attractors and deterrents to the participants' movements and choices and gaze into the world. People tend to look at something that's blinking or has higher contrast. They tend to go away from something that seems scary. Many of these things are part of the principles Disney uses to create virtual theme parks. So Disney called them weenies, like, the castle is a weenie when you're coming down Main Street. That's the thing that's going to draw your attention and pull you towards it. By putting these things in and knowing how people respond to them, you can pretty much predict or guide the participants' experience. And again, these are all detailed in that thesis. The memory stairs, like I said, had experiences from before birth to near death. This was the embryonic chamber, which was before birth. All the sound was through water. There were 2 heartbeats spatialized in this piece. And you heard everything, including people singing lullabies or a fight, as if you were inside the womb. And then the next one, of course, you were just new and you were in the crib and you couldn't move much, but this world had a lot of smells. So there was baby powder smell, and then the mother's face. These faces came in and out of you in the crib, and there was a little mobile playing with a little tinkly tune. And as these faces came in and out, they would goo and coo at you. And when the mother's face came in, though, you smelled the mother's perfume, which was my mother's perfume. So this is sort of an autobiographical, but with a lot of artistic license. So this was a really interesting world. Another one was called the Forgotten Rooms. These rooms were ancient, and every once in a while you'd see the ghost of a child who had lived there come back. There also were smells from the fireplace, just smells of age. And there was a clock on the mantelpiece that ticked, but it ticked at about 1/10 the normal speed. So this world had a very interesting effect on people. There was no way out, which was the other interesting thing, but people spent a lot of time in this particular world. And then the last one was called Release, and it was sort of, going towards the light from under the water, an underwater experience, and that's how the entire thing ended. All right, so that was before 2012, and this what I call the seismic shift, or the third wave of VR. And this was started by Palmer Luckey, who created this Oculus Rift headset, which was actually his kind of 6th version of it that he put out on Kickstarter and got over $2 million, which was like much more than he ever expected to get from it. But his gamer friends were all ready to get inside their games. And so they just poured their money in, and he was able to make this. Now, the interesting thing is he was working at the lab I was at, the Institute for Creative Technologies. Basically, the mixed reality lab gave him a desk and said, do whatever you want, have fun. And that is where he developed the Oculus Rift. And this is one of the first versions of it here, this big blocky square one, which in very short time became this consumer grade model that anybody could buy. So the one that Palmer's wearing on the left is the DK1, Development Kit 1. And we used that for a project I'll talk about in a minute for NASA. But really, it just kind of hit the streets, and everybody who was a gamer or really into VR was now able to afford their own really good head-mounted display. So what happened to make this shift so seismic was that VR had jumped the labs. Anybody, any ordinary person with a few $100 could now get their own headset. And more importantly, this kind of lit the fire under a new generation of creators who wanted to make VR. Now this was within their reach. So moving into VR's third wave, there were tons of new VR titles that were starting to be created and published. And so you could get on the Steam store, the Oculus store, and you could get Job Simulator, which was great fun, or Super Hot VR, or, just dozens and dozens. And the way this happened was that at the same time, easy to use game engines came out, like Unreal and Unity. And there were great asset creation tools, everything from Blender that was pretty much free to high-end Maya and other 3D modeling and rendering tools. And the fact that people could afford it was especially amazing. And artists could afford it. And people started looking at VR for art. So lots of kind of artistic applications came out. But what was most important was that artist tools came out. So there were a number of great tools like Tilt Brush by Google, Gravity Sketch for creating mechs and motor vehicles, Quill for animation. King Spray was sort of a 2D, 3D graffiti program with all of your spray cans simulated really well. Lots and lots of tools, and artists took to these just like a duck to water. So they made all kinds of VR artwork then. I don't know why this keeps advancing, excuse that, but I'll just keep going backwards. Some of it was recreations of classic artwork. So on the right here, we see this French Revolution painting, and this Anna Ziliava was actually creating this at the Louvre, and you could step into her painting. You could actually go in and walk among the 3D people in this painting that she did also as a performance piece. People could watch her make this in tilt brush. So people could make still builds that were either based on classic artworks or on something original, or they could be animated, or you could do figure drawing or portraits. You could have art that accompanied music that was more abstract, but you could also have narrative stories or animation. So VR now becomes a lot of things. It is experience. And one of the best examples of this is Nani de la Peña's immersive journalism. Now, Nani was a student of journalism back in the mid-2000s, and she came up with this concept that she called immersive journalism. She was a journalist, and she adhered to all the principles of journalism, but she wanted to recreate situations that had happened that you might see on the news as a VR experience that you could be in. So the first one she did was Hunger in LA. You see that on the left here. This was a line for a food distribution site in downtown LA where one of the men suffered a diabetic seizure while they were waiting in line because the line was taking too long. And they had the recording of the sound that had happened, and people got in this, and you couldn't help because, you know, it happened, it unfolded as it had happened, but it really, really affected people. People came out of this experience crying. She was invited to bring this to Sundance. Again, this was one of the first VR pieces to go to a film festival. But what a unique one in that it was immersive journalism. And you see Nani here with that same headset that I was using for memory stairs. This was the Wide 5. So we were at the same research lab. And actually, Nani started out as my intern, but then just totally eclipsed me. And it was wonderful to see. On the lower right, there's a picture from her project Syria. That starts when you're downtown and a bomb goes off and you're a child and all of this mayhem ensues. And this was from a real experience. But at the end, you're in the refugee camp and you see all the ghosts of those who have lost their lives in this conflict. So a really powerful, immersive stuff here, really powerful experiences that stick with you and affect you like a typical newscast wouldn't. VR is also narrative. There's lots of beautiful stories, either serial or just one experience that are being done. Some of these are based on properties like Song of the Sea VR. Song of the Sea is an animation by Cartoon Saloon in Ireland. And yet they made this VR experience where you could go in and be amongst all of these beautiful visuals and you could swim around with the main character there. VR is travel. So especially, this has been happening throughout the pandemic. People who are, isolated or who can't get out are able to travel to places. I don't know where these two people are actually seeing here, but they could be in a magical world like this underwater scene. And there are so many beautiful VR travel experiences available today. But VR is also connection. And that's what we've found out, especially during the pandemic, that we can jump into a virtual world together and we can actually feel like we are having some kind of physical connection through our avatars. Now, in the upper right, this is a very interesting possible future for VR. This is a mother who lost her child and is able to visit the child in VR after that child had died. I'll let you think about that for a minute. Will that be in your future? So I'm going to talk about a project I did for NASA next. And this was a project that was very much about connection. And it was about how do you keep people that are going to be living on Mars connected to their loved ones back on Earth. So this was an actual scientific study done at a Mars habitat on Mauna Loa, Hawaii. It's just this structure you see here, and it's the land around it is very much like Mars. It's a volcanic mountain. 6 scientists agreed to be locked up for a full year in that structure. And they were in this kind of suitable but contained living habitat. On Mars, they would have made their own water, but here they had 500-gallon tanks brought in every 6 months. But they had no real-time communication with anybody outside the habitat. And if they went outside, they had to put on hazmat suits, like an EVA kind of thing. Now, how do you combat social isolation and sensory deprivation in an environment like that? In an environment where you're with the same 6 people for a full year and you get to know every cough and sneeze that they do. And how do you give them an escape? So we came up with this project for NASA called Ansible, which is a network of social interactions and bilateral enhancement, actually is an acronym. And we were able to build a series of virtual reality environments and put them in that habitat. And we did it with the new Oculus Rift headset. And it was actually the DK2, the Developer Kit 2. So this was our version 0.0001 of a holodeck for NASA. How can we use this to keep these future astronauts healthy and sane? So we gave them interesting things like personal virtual homes that they could decorate. We gave them shopping malls that they could go in and put things together. We gave them ways to change the weather. We gave them a central hub where they could leave messages for each other. And they could even animate their avatars and record that animation and leave that animation for their friends or family who might come in later. Because there was no synchronous communication, the scientists were able to go into the world on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then the family and friends back on Earth could go in Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. And every morning about 3 a.m., we would synchronize the world so that the other side could see what their counterparts had been doing on the day they weren't there. So it was a way to connect in a sort of an embodied way, but better than email. We made them a lot of vacation spots, things they could do like skiing or going to the beach or even, visiting Gale Crater. They could visit each other's home sites. There was a lot they could do. We gave them a virtual club where they could watch movies with their avatar. And we even got Reggie Watts to come in and sing a special song that he made up on the fly for these 6 scientists who were sequestered for that year. And we captured him as a fully volumetric 3D avatar and then put him on the stage for them as a surprise. This is the team that built this. It was not a huge team, but a great team. And we got a lot of papers out of this about how this can positively affect your psychological health. We had a control group that didn't have this, so we had something great to compare it with. And you can see videos and things at my All These Worlds site. So we're coming to the end here. VR Art Today has an explosion of new and established artists. There are so many, I can't even list them all, but the work is amazing. It can include performance pieces like Gary Villarreal did a piece with the Angel City Chorale where he illustrated some of the music that they were playing with a full orchestra and a full choral group in real time. And that was quite a while ago, I think, like 4 years ago now. And we have virtual museums. We have museums that are in VR that show work like this that you can go in and interact with. And, some of them are just beautiful things. And some of them are very interactive, or you can move and it changes the artwork. And these kinds of galleries are starting to become much more popular. Now, for this particular one, you do have to have a headset to get into it, but there are some that you can see either through a web VR interface or through the headset interface. And there are more classes that are happening. I teach a couple down at Otis College of Art and Design, but they're everywhere now. So we are training the new generation of artists to use these tools and techniques so that they can create something wonderful. And so they have been, and it's going to be interesting to see where it all goes in the future. Tomorrow, well, there are going to be more tools, more artists, more innovations, and think of just this one. Remember I said that in the early days there weren't any avatars or people in these virtual worlds? That's changing. So Unreal just put out a way for you to create what they're calling metahumans in the Unreal Engine. And this is a very high-end, very high photorealistic virtual human that can be used in everything from the PS4 to a fully immersive VR piece. But I put this picture on the right to show you that even your phone is going to be able to allow you to capture yourself in 3D and put yourself in these virtual worlds. This is a picture from 4 years ago captured with my my Android phone with a 3D scanning package, because there was a 3D camera lens in that phone. And, you know, it takes this one took a few seconds. Today, you can do that in like 5 seconds. I would like to show this MetaHumans 1-minute video just to show you what's coming. Now, can you see the video or not?
I am a metahuman.
Are you able to see the video?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So here's our
Exploration
metahuman.
of digital human powered by Unreal Engine. Metahumans are high-fidelity digital characters created by you, the user, on our new content creation platform, MetaHuman Creator. I am fully rigged, ready for animation and motion capture, allowing you to work in context. With everything running live in Unreal Engine, my motion works seamlessly
on other characters. I have 8 levels of detail and have been tested on a wide range of hardware platforms, from feature film to mobile. If you're interested in learning about my animation rig or high-fidelity deformations, built on Control Rig, the new strand-based hair system via the Groom component, or how everything is tied together and animated in Sequencer, then have a look under the hood in this project. This is just a glimpse of things to come.
So I don't know about you, but that just blew me away. And that only came out like a week or so ago. The other thing that we're finding for people who are starting to build these virtual experiences with humans, with metahumans, with characters, is that there is a new talent needed, which is creating conversations for these characters. Many of them will not be avatars. They won't have a human behind them, but they will be driven by AI systems. So they'll be able to converse with you, but getting those conversations to be believable, to be human-oriented, to give these characters personality, that's a whole new ball game coming out. So our final thoughts here, you know, for designing experiences that are meaningful and compelling, how do we do this? You know, some of the techniques we've developed, some still need to be developed, but this has got to be where the participant inhabits a space in a visceral way and gets a personal connection to that experience and completes that experience. It's not complete until they get in and make their decisions and their choices. This takes that space that has been made into something that's a place that becomes memorable, that gives you memories and affects you every bit as much as the physical world that we exist in now. It's going to be a really interesting blend of physical and virtual coming down the road. And so we need more creators to be building things that are meaningful to us as humans. All right, thanks for listening. Here's some contact information. If I don't know if we have time for questions, but I'm happy to take a few if anybody has any. I know that was kind of a wild ride.
Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Morie? We've got a couple minutes if we do.
Sure, I have a question, if you don't mind.
Okay.
So were you able to hear that?
I didn't hear the question. I heard I have a question.
We have a question from our live audience. One of our students is asking, what is the best way to get into VR development for those that are interested in getting started?
Well, you live in a time where it's so easy to get into VR development because there are so many things out there on YouTube. You know, pick one of the game engines, pick Unreal or Unity, and start learning that. If you're technical, you can learn to model. There are as many different tasks for creating VR as there are, just like in a film where there's so many different areas that you could excel in. You could be a modeler, you could be, a character creator, you could be the one that writes the scripts, you could do the intricacies of the interactions in the game engine. A real easy way to get started is to use WebXR. So during this lockdown, I've been teaching my students at the art college with WebXR tools, and this is a real kind of low overhead way to start building stuff in that you can experience as a VR world. And the two big ones are Mozilla Hubs, that's open source. It gives you a content creation package that is called Spoke. Spoke connects you to things like Sketchfab and Google Poly, where you can bring in assets and sounds and images, and there's some particle systems and things like that. And you can build a world there, publish the world, and then you and your friends can get in the world and explore. There's also a new package called Styly, STYLY.cc. And that's another WebXR. So this is totally VR that's on the web. And when you publish those creations to either Hubs or Styly, the person that comes to the URL you send them can either enter with a headset on or just enter 2D on the screen. So that's why I say it's low overhead. You don't even have to have any equipment. Just have to have a somewhat decent computer. I do it on my Mac, so it doesn't need a high-end rendering computer. So those two things are really simple. Also, just get in and try things. For AltSpace VR has hundreds of events every week, so you can kind of see what's available there. VR Chat is another social VR package, and both of those I think you can get into with a headset or just through a 2D screen. So you can see what's out there with AltSpace VR and VR Chat. You can get your feet wet with Styly or Mozilla Hubs, or you can get your feet super wet by going and learning Unity or Unreal or a modeling package or a character design package. The MetaHuman thing I showed is not quite out yet for public use, but it will be by June, I think they said. And that's another thing that somebody can be able to create amazing characters that way. So I hope that gives you a good start. All right, any other questions?
I believe we have one in the chat, which is, with keeping people on Morie.
I cannot seem to get back to my my meeting window. I don't know where.
I'll read the question.
Yes, that would be lovely. Thank you.
With keeping people on Morie,
we have with keeping
loved ones.
People on Mars connected to their loved ones. They were given a lot of freedom to the astronauts to control their environment, including things we don't have control in our lives, like weather. Does having more or less control have an impact on how people feel about the experience? That was a question from the chat.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, that one, we could praise Betty for another few years there. The control may be one of the things that makes them feel like they're less, that they have more power. Certainly, they can't go outside, so they don't have that choice. But we had one of those scientists who just totally made crazy things happening in his home space. And then he did all of these recordings of his avatar giving you a tour of that home space. And he was really funny about it. So it had a lot of humor in it. And I think it was a big outlet for him. And he was part of the glue that held that team together for the 12 months. So it's going to be different for every person. Maybe being able to create while they're locked up is going to be key for some people. Maybe the leaving messages as an avatar recording will be key for other people. Maybe just going and floating down a river with your avatar and hearing the frogs and the crickets might be another thing. So based on a particular person's needs and personality, I think there are different things that give them that sense of well-being. So we haven't unpacked that totally. Matching up the personality to what a particular person might need, but I think that's something that's got to come. Putting these crews together. One of the things NASA traditionally has not done is look at how people work together. Whether these personalities are compatible. But it's something that they may need to start thinking about, especially if we're going to send people out to inhospitable environments like Mars or the moon.
There's another question in chat. Would you like me to read it aloud?
Please, please.
Do you see a future where humanity chooses virtual reality over a real life experience and the constraints that come with it? For example, not being able to traverse the universe in a human lifetime due to the speed of light being too slow or compared to the vast distances of space.
I'm hoping that it's never one or the other, that virtual experiences can enrich us and expand what we can know and understand and experience beyond our physicality and our physical world as it is today. So, I may never go to the pyramids, but I could actually, through a virtual reality environment, walk through some of those pyramids and smell what they smell like, and have my little lantern and go examine all of the little carvings or paintings. So why would I choose that over over going in person? Well, maybe I can't go in person. Maybe it's too expensive, or maybe I'm bedridden, whatever it is. Having the option to go see these things or experience these things, or fly, or be a particle in a particle accelerator just for the heck of it. These are things that maybe we couldn't do normally, that give us more options in our lifetime. So hopefully it's a mix. It's a mix of things. I don't know, if we'll ever do the Matrix where people just jack in and stay there forever. I don't see that as a future for humans, but in terms of expanding our options, I think we've got a lot of possibilities.
Yes, hello. I have a question. There might be a few nested. I'm not sure. How many jobs are available in the VR world, and what is the community like in VR? Because it seems to be a lot bigger than I originally thought it was. And what do you do in those jobs? Like, there's different areas of it. Like you mentioned art, there's programming. Like, what are like the different jobs that you can get with VR?
Well, everything from marketing a company's VR products to building the products to doing studies on how those products are affecting people to, there's actually jobs in all kinds of things like packaging. So somebody puts out a particular VR experience, but they want it in kiosks at malls. Somebody's got to design that. somebody's got to write the marketing copy for that. So what we saw when that third wave of VR hit and dozens of companies opened in the LA area, that community would get together every week or so for events or panels or whatever. And almost always there were jobs that were out there, either senior Unity developer, junior modeler, texture artist, character designer, marketing manager, someone who might be a fundraiser. There's so many of these jobs that swirl around the core thing of that one VR experience. It's an infrastructure that supports these as businesses, and so there's just many ways to get involved, even if you're not an artist or a programmer yourself. And just so many people did that we probably had a community of about 3,000 or 4,000 people here in LA alone. LA in the Bay Area was probably multiple thousands of people in that heyday, and it would have continued, I think, except that we hit this pandemic. Certainly things like location-based entertainment, those things were just riding a wave until people couldn't get together in these arcades or these places. We're going to see them come back. We're going to see even sort of niche things like immersive performances, immersive theater. Those are related to VR as well, but they require, performers to be as part of that. The film industry in Hollywood is starting to experiment with immersive films too. So again, all of those jobs that are in film production, there are going to be similar jobs for setting up sets, for getting the cameras, for building the backgrounds, whether they're digital or physical. So all of these things are jobs that could be had in the VR industry.